Thanks, Julio. Thanks everybody for coming and making the event happen. These things don't just happen; they only come because people participate and make drives and take flights to come here and be with other people who care about frogs. I'm working with box turtles right now. I'm really a frog guy. So my favorite frogs I'm going to be talking about tonight are Mantellas. And I'll kind of want to give an overview of what Mantellas are about. I'll go through all the species. And then the last half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about their conservation and kind of finish up with a few thoughts about their captive husbandry. So I was trying to think about why Mantellas, why I care about Mantellas, and kind of all comes back to dart frogs. And this is a picture of me at maybe age 11 or 12, and one of those terrariums on the bottom is a tank of Leucomelas, and the other is a tank of golden Mantellas. And kind of the thing that got me, I think gets a lot of people interested in Mantellas, is just they're really similar to dart frogs in many ways. They often look similar. They have this bright warning coloration. And they have this bright warning coloration to kind of warn predators of their poisonous skin alkaloids, which actually Mantellas have some of the same chemical compounds in their skin that a lot of poison dart frogs do. This allows them to be diurnal, so they're often active during the day. And Mantellas lay eggs on land, which is not all that common in amphibians. And one species, Mantella levigata, actually feeds its tadpoles infertile eggs, like some dart frogs. But despite all these similarities, Mantellas and dart frogs are actually not that closely related. So it's kind of fun to point out that dart frogs are more closely related to true toads than Mantellas, and Mantellas are more closely related to Asian flying frogs than they are to dart frogs. And they're also found in totally different places, totally different parts of the world. So dart frogs in the neotropics, Central and South America, and Mantellas are only found on the island of Madagascar. This is Madagascar. It's the fourth largest island in the world. It's about the size of Texas. And it has just this amazing diversity of environments on it. Kind of down the middle of the island, you have the central highlands, where you have this mountain range. And on the east of the island, you actually get kind of this lowland, lush tropical forest that you might associate with dart frogs and kind of tropical areas. And as you move up in altitude, that kind of changed. But as we get on the west side of the island, you actually get dry deciduous forest, so the trees change colors, lose their leaves. The forest is like crisp and crunchy when you're walking through. It's a very different type of place. And down in the southwest, it actually kind of feels like the American Southwest, kind of like Arizona. It's all the plants and spines. It's the spiny forest. It's dry. It's arid. So it's it's only about the size of Texas, but it has all these different environments in it. And it also has just an amazing diversity of amphibian species. It has about 3 times the species of frogs that the entire continent of North America has, all on this island. And kind of the wonderful thing is that all of these frogs, all but 3, are only found there. So these are the frogs we'll be talking about tonight. These are the 16 species of Mantella. They all kind of get lumped together a lot of the time when you think about Mantellas, but they are actually a little different. Taxonomists kind of break them down into 6 different species groups. And the first group that we look at is the Mantella aurantiaca group. So golden Mantella, the most iconic frog in the genus. They're only found in a handful of breeding sites, a few dozen, in east central Madagascar. This is a photo of Porto wetland, and they're found in the streams that kind of come out of this wetland. On the sides of these streams, there's these seasonal pools, these open areas in the forest that fill with water for a couple months a year in December and January. They use these sites to breed. It's another aurantiaca breeding site. So for most of the year, they're kind of up in the forest, and you're not able to find them, and there's just a few months where they're kind of all coming down, congregating at this breeding area and reproducing. You get a lot of variation in coloration all at one site. You know, for a while there was constant thought that red Arntiaka were found at one site and yellow Arntiaka at another. But really, if you go to a breeding site, you can kind of find a mix of frogs all together. Just to highlight, there's been a lot of work done on Arntiaka with highlight one study that might be interesting to everybody here. Just looking at what they eat in the wild. Most wild frogs were eating ants and flies and springtails. So when we feed our captive frogs flies and springtails, it's not too far off. Maybe not getting the diversity they get in the wild, but you know, it's not too far off. Mantella Arntiaka are also highly threatened. They're critically endangered, and they're one of two species of Mantellas that actually has a conservation plan designed for it that's ratified by the Malagasy government and led by the NGO Madagascar and there's just been a lot of kind of positive work done to help ensure that these frogs continue to exist. Second species in the Arntiaka group is Mantella crocea. They're very similar to Mantella Arntiaka. They breed at these seasonally flooded pools, these open areas in the forest that kind of open up and fill with water for a couple months of the year. They have a larger distribution than gold Mantellas. Just another photo of their breeding ponds. A lot of variation in terms of the coloration. These two frogs are from the pet trade, probably collected near Hufa, and the brown and bronzy ones are from that breeding pond I just showed you. You also get green crocea to the west and north that are pretty striking. The last species in the Arntiaka group is the black-eared Mantella. This is actually a picture of a different wetland than the one I showed you before, but it's kind of the same story. It's this large wetland. There's these streams that kind of trickle off from it. Along these streams are these open areas in the forest that's left, these breeding pools that fill with water for a couple months of the year. Here's one of them. You get a lot of different colored mountain panums, so you get yellow and green frogs and red frogs. And in the pet trade, where we're kind of exporting in the early 2000s and late 90s, were entirely red frogs. But that's just because the breeding site where collectors were getting frogs from has entirely red frogs. But there's a nice kind of survey done of wild populations. They looked at how many frogs were green and how many were red at each site, and they found that most sites have kind of a mixture of green and red frogs. There also are sites that seem to only have all yellow or all green frogs. And then there's kind of these funky intermediate populations where you get frogs that kind of look like red crocea, where they have this black face mask, and frogs that look just like the typical mountain panum all at the same site. For a couple decades, actually, people wondered if mountain panum, the black-eared Mantella, was just a color variant of Mantella crocea, because genetically they're actually very similar. The black-eared Mantella was actually initially described from frogs exported from the pet trade, and there was just a lot of people were just wondering if maybe they're actually the same species. But just as last year, that was actually resolved. It looks like they are. Mantella mountain panum is a distinct species from crocea, and the most interesting part of the study was actually that Mantella, the green Mantella crocea, also seemed to be kind of genetically distinct. The second group of Mantellas is the Madagascariensis group. There's just two species in the genus that are in that group. Mantella Madagascariensis. They're also found in east central Madagascar, but a little further south of the other frogs I just showed you photos of. And I was going through my photos. I've been to one site where they occur, but a number of times. And I was going through my photos and trying to find a nice shot of their picture of their habitat, and I found a site that we visited in January, but where actually Julio found our Madagascariensis was in this clump of wild ginger, which is an introduced species next to the road. That's grass. That's a eucalyptus tree. It's not really pristine habitat. And so I was hoping to find an actual photo of the breeding pond or something that I had taken. I found this photo from 2007, and it's, I think, the exact same patch of wild ginger where we found Madagascariensis in January. So. I found this photo too. This is a little further down from that wild ginger patch, maybe more typical of what their habitat looks like. Maybe a little bit of variation in terms of their colors, especially in the amount of banding they have on their legs. But then you also get kind of unusual Madagascariensis that have some patterns on their dorsum. And people often wonder how to tell kind of the two painted Mantellas apart. So you have Madagascariensis and Mantella baroni, and they look very similar. But if you flip them over, you can look, the Madagascariensis will have a horseshoe-shaped marking on their throat. That's the easiest example. And then also the red on their hind limbs too will extend further up onto the thighs. It's Mantella pulchra. Kind of look like a dirty Madagascariensis. They're found further north. This is a photo of one of their breeding ponds. It's a little more, the canopy's a little more closed, but otherwise it's kind of similar. Mantella's story, it floods for a couple months of the year. The frogs come out of the forest, breed at it, then leave as it dries. They can really look quite a bit like Madagascariensis. And when I was putting this presentation together, I was kind of reminded that actually they're really closely related. So in some ways, you can kind of think of Mantella pulchra as kind of a northern form of Madagascariensis. The third group of Mantellas is the Kiwani group. These Mantellas are a little different than the other species we looked at so far. They're streamside frogs that have a different call. They're a little larger. Their call is kind of a single note metallic dink as opposed to like a two-part click. And they're all found along fast-moving streams. Mantella Kiwani. They're found in the central highlands of Madagascar at the highest altitude of any Mantella. They're only found in about 4 locations, and these areas are pretty much completely deforested. It's kind of a look at the landscape. That's not natural forest, that's maybe eucalyptus or some pine there. And there's actually Mantella Kiwani in this photograph. That's why I took this photograph on the rock here somewhere, but I'm not sure which one of these dots is the frog. But I do remember taking this photo and thinking, it's going to be a great shot of Kiwani habitat.
This is just a bump.
This is a different Kiwani site. But again, similar to these big granite slopes, there's not a lot of cover. They're only active in the very early morning, then they kind of retreat into these mossy tufts on the side. I guess they come out again later in the day once the sun goes away. The third Kiwani site, this site actually has a little forest left. But again, it's a fast-moving stream in the highlands. This site's kind of special because it's found at an altitude it's one of the highest altitudes where Mantella baroni, the painted Mantella, occurs, and also the lowest altitude where Mantella Kiwani occurs, and they actually occur here together. About 1 in 4 frogs you find will look like Mantella Kiwani, the rest will kind of look more like Mantella baroni or a mix in between. A normal Kiwani. I mentioned the conservation strategy for golden Mantella, and Mantella Kiwani actually is the other Mantella that has a conservation strategy put in place for it, ratified by the Malagasy government. It was put in place in 2008, and not a lot happened. There's set aside a community-run protected area for them, which is nice. But it's actually kind of revitalized just this last year, about a year ago in December. So I think there's a lot of good things coming. I'll talk about some of those later in the talk. The second species in the Kiwani group is the painted Mantella. They have a really large distribution in east central Madagascar. They're kind of, when you think of Mantella and like the lush, beautiful tropical rainforest, Mantella baroni fits that description. They're found in rainforest streams. Sometimes the green can be a little more yellow. Sometimes the banding on the legs can be kind of brown. That's a juvenile. Juvenile Mantellas morph out looking different than adult frogs. There were a couple question marks on the distribution map, and those are these southern populations that, these are all frogs from one site, and the Veroni kind of have the spots at the insertion of their forelimbs kind of end up going up onto their dorsum, and then some will be entirely green, and others that kind of look like nigricans, but they behave and seem to act just like Veroni, and genetically are pretty close. Mantella heromiri. This is one of two species of Mantella I've never seen in the wild. And the reason I haven't gone to see them is they're just kind of out of the way. They're not on the way to anything else. They're down in the southeast. These are the same 4 pictures you see floating around of this species on the internet. This is my one picture of the species at the Shed Aquarium. And the last species in the Quantity group is Mantella nigricans. You can kind of think of Mantella nigricans as a northern form of Mantella veroni. Very similar habitat along streams and mid-altitude rainforest. Some photos of habitat at Salmena, Malagasy. Another shot of nigricans habitat. The frogs in the top row are nigricans from the most northern localities where they occurred. Frogs there have entirely brown dorsums. Frogs further south are kind of more typical of what you think of Mantella nigricans. Fourth group of Mantellas is the Mantella betsilio group. So 2 brown Mantellas, Mantella betsilio, Mantella denaui. I know the pictures look different here, but there's actually no real morphological difference between the two. They look pretty much identical. And the best way to kind of think about them is Mantella betsilio is found in the south and southwest, and they're much more closely related to Mantella expectata, the blue-legged Mantella, whereas Mantella denaui is found in the north. They're much more closely related to the green Mantella, Mantella viridis. There's a nice figure from an article illustrating that. So viridis is way up top here, and denaui is a little further south than them. Mantella betsilio, this is the other species of Mantella I've not seen in the wild, but they have a big distribution in western Madagascar. They inhabit these kind of dry western deciduous forests, so the trees lose their leaves. It's dry, it's hot. There's this, I kind of putting this presentation together, I kind of stumbled across this photo that was labeled Mantella betsilio breeding pool, and it's just like a hole in the rock. So that was kind of interesting. That's another photo of the type of forest where Mantella betsilio lives. And the closely related blue-legged Mantella, Mantella expectata. They're only known from southwestern Madagascar, one site in Salu, and that site is composed of these dry sandstone masses, it's dry sandstone like canyons. It's a pretty unique place. It's only green in this photo because this is the wet season. Most of the rest of the year it's brown, it's dry, it's hot. It's just it's not a place you'd expect to see a blue-legged frog. I'm going to do some familiar people in this photo. This is in January, and we went looking for them in January, which is a little late. Normally you'd expect to see Mantella expectata in December, usually just the first few weeks, right when the rains arrive. And I was really skeptical we'd find any, because when we got there, it was hot. What was that?
Said Sean needs to go out in the sun more.
This is true. This is true. A little pink. A little pink.
10 seconds.
Yeah, it was a hot day. It was probably like 90 degrees out there, and not great frog weather.
This is 3 guys scaring the shit out of a frog?
This is exactly what is going on. This is exactly what's going on.
You don't see the round of us around that chair.
And a local staring at us going, what the hell are they?
But the guy, yes. Well, the amazing part was we found or one of the group members, is not here tonight, but he found the Mantella under a rock when he was flipping rocks to look for geckos and scorpions. And after he found that first one, we all started kind of lifting rocks up and kind of looking under. We found another one, and so it's not the typical place where you might expect to find these, beautiful frogs. Yeah, it's the only place, it's a cool spot with some moisture there. These are just some photos of expectata eggs in situ. The way it was described to me was early January when they went to find these, and every grassy tuft that you see in the picture kind of had a clump of eggs in it. But it was it's a very particular time of the year, right before the rains arrive. When the rains arrive, that will be a flowing river. There's some variation in their coloration. You get these ones with red backs. They also hybridized Mantella vexillio. That's a picture of a hybrid. And then there's these kind of funny-looking frogs, or some question marks on the map again, that genetically are really similar to Mantella expectata, but look a little different. Mantella ebenaui, found in northern Madagascar. You can find them in kind of nice pristine habitat, lowland, rainforest. You can also find them in roadside ditches. Some variation in the coloration. Sometimes they have these X or diamond-shaped markings on the dorsum. You also get funny-looking frogs that kind of look like ebenaui or virides or something in between the two. And there was some work done to figure out what these are. And turns out Mantella ebenaui and Mantella virides are very closely related. You can kind of think of the green Mantella virides as a very far northern ebenaui. This is the green Mantella virides. It's a photo of the forest where they occur. I took the photo on the right. This is just a dry stream bed. There are males calling from hidden positions in the stream bed, but I also found this photo of a mango plantation where they also occur, so a little more degraded habitat. These are captive frogs. There's some kind of lighter colored frogs or dark colored frogs. There's some variation in the look. And then the last two species groups, the Mantella laevigata and Mantella bernardi groups, they're kind of the oddballs of the genus. They're kind of different from the other frogs we've looked at. This is Mantella moneri. For a number of years, they really only found along, known from just a few specimens along this stream in Malagasy National Park. But they found them more recently at a few other localities. All these streams are kind of large, bouldery rocks, moving water, not too high. The word moneri means to force in Malagasy, and the taxonomist who described this frog kind of felt forced to describe it before it was described from frogs that feared were going to be exported from the pet trade. One of the sites that occurs alongside Mantella ebenaui, and you also get kind of funny in between frogs like this one. Mantella laevigata, this is probably the most unusual Mantella. Found in northeastern Madagascar, low elevation rainforest, especially around bamboo. It breeds in water-filled bamboo wells. It usually lays one or maybe a few more eggs at a time. They have kind of large toe pads that help them climb. And the males defend these breeding sites, so they're kind of more like dart frogs than all the other Mantellas, because the females feed and pearl eggs, tadpoles. Has anybody read Antipode? Yeah, it's kind of a fun book. It's basically a field journal of a biologist who studied laevigata for a couple years. And she turned it into a book. It's kind of a fun read. Just to highlight, I think, an interesting study on laevigata, a recent one. These researchers wanted to know if there's kind of a difference in what they're eating during different seasons, and then if these poisonous skin alkaloids kind of changed with the seasons as well. And they found during the wet season they're eating a larger diversity of prey. In the dry season they're relying really heavily on ants. but they didn't really find too much of a difference in those the chemical compounds in their skin. And the last species, Mantella bernardi, is also kind of an unusual one. Found in southeastern Madagascar, at kind of lower elevations than some of the other species we've looked at. For quite a while, they were only known from this one forest fragment of unprotected land where they were collected for the pet trade. But more recent work has identified a few other sites where they occur, so that's good news. They're not a super flashy frog. I think they're still pretty nice. And that's it. So those are the 16 species in the genus. I hope you have a better understanding of kind of the differences between them, and all Mantellas aren't the same. But kind of the one thing they do share in common is that they all are, 10 to 16 species are highly threatened. The Mantella artiaca and Malagasy are considered critically endangered by the IUCN. Kawani, Haramiri, Expectata, Viridis are endangered. And this is mainly a result of habitat loss, but there's also kind of all these different threats acting on Mantellas and really all amphibians. So I wanted to kind of just look at the threat of habitat loss and also kind of look at the threat of collection of frogs for the pet trade as well, because that's one that might be relevant to people in this room. And I want to point out too that this is not a unique situation for Mantellas, but really all amphibians are kind of under all these threats. It's estimated that almost a little over 3% of frog species have actually gone extinct since the 1970s, and you saw that presentation of how all these threatened frogs from Ecuador, how kind of serious this situation is. When you look at kind of all these groups of animals and proportion of threatened species in each group, you can see amphibians are right up there. There's another book just to put out another reading suggestion. Has anybody read this one? Yeah. Yeah, it's good. It's not too sciencey. It's a science writer. She kind of follows around biologists. It starts with Ada Lopez in Panama, so looking for something to read. And the major threat for Mantellas is really habitat loss. People use the land to eat, especially through using slash and burn agriculture, and this works really well when you got a lot of forest and you have not a lot of people. But in Madagascar, there's just not a lot of forest left, and there's a lot of people. This is a map of kind of the forest cover that remains in Madagascar. It's gone down by about half since the 1950s. Just to show you what that kind of looks like, I went to Google Earth. This kind of white area here, this is Andasibe, the village where I lived for about 6 years. And this kind of fingery brown thing in the middle, that's Porto Wetland, the first wetland we looked at where the golden Mantella occur. And just I've watched this part right here, this part of the forest here. So this is 94, and 2003, and 2010. Can anybody guess what that is? Yeah. And this is 2019. There's just no forest left down here. Not that much right here. This is the nickel and cobalt mine. I guess it's not the largest nickel mine in the world anymore, but it's still a pretty big one. It's not just large extractive industries that are destroying Mantella habitat, but also kind of small-scale artisanal mining. This is, I think, a sapphire ruby mine. This is a gold. People looking for gold at an artiaca breeding habitat, and that's a Mantella artiaca I found in the hole. This is a Rosewood logging camp in northern Madagascar. Logging, both legal and illegal mining, illegal logging is a big problem. And really, habitat destruction is the main threat that Mantellas are facing, a pretty urgent threat. But I also did want to kind of mention collection of frogs for the pet trade. I think it's kind of interesting to think about that. There was a nice study I want to highlight from last year that actually reviewed the wildlife trade in Madagascar. I looked at the number of species that were coming out, reptiles and amphibians, and also just the money that it brings in. So we've seen kind of some examples of sustainable trade tonight in Colombia and Ecuador. Well, in Madagascar, it's more just collection from the wild. And there's kind of often this idea that people are collecting the frogs in the forest or these wild animals, and that gives them an incentive to protect the forest. But because it's bringing in money. But I think what this review really shows is that it's really not bringing in much money, especially for the people who live where the frogs are. The exporters and the capital are really making all the profit, whereas the people who live where the frogs are, can buy a cup of coffee after they collect a bunch of mantellas. And it's also, I thought this was interesting. I was bringing in actually, this is from 2013, I think it brought in quite a lot of money. This is reptiles and amphibians. The Ministry of Environment only got about $14,000 from that, so it's not really bringing in a lot of money, certainly not enough to really protect much habitat. So I went to the CITES database. This is the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, and I looked at just kind of Mantella exports over time. Peak Mantella trade was in 2001. 43,000 individual frogs were exported. 2010 to 2018, the last few years, it's gone down to about a fifth of that. But what species are being exported? It's mostly been Arntiaca since '94. For some reason, CITES doesn't recognize Mantella ebenaui, so Mitsinjo includes Mantella ebenaui. More recently, though, and probably what people in this room have observed, certainly what I've been seeing, is mostly Mantella baroni and Mantella Mitsinjo or ebenaui. So these are actually least concerned species. They're not highly threatened. So this is actually kind of a positive change. It's not a critically endangered frog being exported by the tens of thousands every year. It's two species that have a much bigger distribution and maybe aren't as threatened as Arntiaca. But there are a lot of good things happening to kind of try and address some of these threats. And I mentioned before, there are these two conservation strategies, one for Mantella Arntiaca and one for Mantella Kauai. The proceeds from the auction today are going towards the Kauai action plan. And what these look like is they're ratified by the Malagasy government, and you get kind of this action plan through meetings with both local people who live there, local government, and you come up with a list of actions to address the threats and the players people who are going to be carrying out those actions and the timeline. And certainly for Arntiaca, it's actually worked pretty well. There's a new protected area that's been set up for Arntiaca. There's also a picture of some monitoring we did as part of that action plan for Arntiaca in 2012. And I think the plan for Arntiaca has actually really made a difference. There are also a lot of really inspiring reforestation efforts going on in Madagascar. I just want to point out, it seems like every other conservation organization you bump into in Madagascar has a tree nursery set up with native plants. The Mitsinjo, the community group I worked with for a few years, they actually, over that time period, planted over 250,000 native trees. And we're controlling that habitat, protecting that habitat. So they're, I do want to point out that, habitat loss it's happening fast, and you can't just replant all the forest. But there are kind of positive things happening in Madagascar too. There's also the breeding facility was set up. These are all Arntiaca, captive survival assurance colony. It's run by people who live near the frogs. That's really important. And I came back in 2016, but the year after I came back, in collaboration with another NGO and also that nickel mine, they did the first reintroduction, an experimental reintroduction. They released over 1,000 individuals at ponds that they created or restored, so they had to figure out how to kind of retain water during the correct time of year, and so they made some changes to the substrate, and there's actually some positive signs that maybe some of these populations I've actually stuck around these last 2 years. It's going to take another probably 5 or 10 years of monitoring to really figure out if this worked or not, but it's definitely encouraging. So let's kind of wrap things up. I thought I'd just kind of mention a little bit about their care and captivity, and there are, these 3 resources on caring for mantellas in captivity. They're all, I think they're like 20 years old now, and they're written by the same guy, so but they're out there. And I think the takeaway is, Mantellas are really hardy. They live in a number of conditions. You can keep them in plastic boxes on foam rubber. You can keep them in an aquarium in gravel. You can keep them in a beautiful naturalistic terrarium. They're really hardy frogs. But they really don't breed under particular conditions. So you really need to dry them out and cool them off during the winter. They're very seasonal amphibians. And they'll have no problem getting down to the 50s if you can put them in a basement or near a window or something like that to really cool them off during the winter to get them to reproduce. Then when it warms up, you can kind of flood the terrarium. And then you have to kind of monitor the females to figure out if they're laying eggs. They like to hide the eggs and kind of stick them in the most inconvenient places. They also breed best big groups. If you just have a pair of Mantellas, you're probably not going to get any fertile eggs. You want big groups, 6, 10, 15 frogs. And just to point out, this is a picture of reproduction at Mitsinjo. You need multiple males fertilizing one clutch. You would see 3 or 4 males sometimes all on the same clutch. And lastly, just to point out, when you think about breeding Mantellas in captivity, it's, most of the time it's Aurantiaca, maybe a little bit Expectata or Virides or Ebenaui. But there are these other frogs like Baroni and Nigricans, and when Kawani was available too, that just really don't have a good record of being bred in captivity. They're still, Baroni and Nigricans are still widely available, and so if you're keeping them, it's worth maybe trying some new things, things that we haven't done with Mantellas before, to try and stimulate them to breed. Lastly, I'd just like to invite everybody to come along next year. We have a few spots left. We're going to be going up to Malagasy National Park for the first half of this trip, and the last half of the trip in Andasibe. We had a really great time. I think this is going to be a fun one too. Malagasy is a really wonderful park to have. It's not really visited that often, which is a shame, but just because it's kind of remote and hard to get to. But there's actually pretty good infrastructure there. These tent camps. You get to kind of go up the mountain. You get to see the change from low elevation rainforest all the way up to these dwarf kind of montane forest. And there's really just an amazing variety of wildlife there. There's a silky sea foca. There's a Bercacia Valley that you get to hike through. The first camp where you stay is called Camp Mantella. If that gives you an indication of what might be found there. It's also great Uroplatus. So I think that should be a nice first half of the trip. And the second half we'll spend in Andasibe. This is the village where I used to live, and there's just a number of really great reserves in the area. It'll be a little easier to stay at pretty comfortable accommodations. But that doesn't mean we won't see wildlife. There's really just great frogs. There's other animals too. Madagascar's largest lemur, weird tenrecs, all sorts of cool stuff. So if you're interested to talk to Mike from Black Jungle, give you more information. So just to wrap it up, hopefully you kind of go away from this knowing that all Mantellas aren't really the same. It's a diverse genus, and although a good portion of them are highly threatened, there actually are some encouraging conservation efforts underway. And there's also just a lot we still don't know, so there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of figure these frogs out. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.